So maybe if we can settle down. Um, okay. My name is Shafiq Adams. My day job is at the Water Research Commission. So finance is totally out of my comfort zone, but I guess it's the right person to have this discussion with, because you'll also have to convince me, because I need to take it back to plenary. And so I'm not coming with a lot of biases. The original plan was for the presidency to give the technical overview, but we seem to be missing that person, unless he's in Ruby. So I hope, but we have got a plan B, and a very good plan B in Deepak, that will set up the discussion, and for us to stimulate discussions, work through some of the issues related to finance. And then, yeah, let's not waste any more time. And we can maybe give Deepak, and then we'll quickly do a kind of who's who in the room, because it is a stakeholder consultation. I just don't want to have a conversations amongst ourselves or a particular group. So I apologize, Deepak, but I just grabbed him from coffee to do this in the, anyway, you want.
Thank you, Shafiq, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's not often that I'm called on to be Plan B, and I'm hoping that I'll be as eloquent as Rudy would have been in setting the stage for this conversation. I suppose I'm going to start, and hopefully not oversimplifying the issues related to the just energy transition. I'm going to spend a few minutes locating the just energy transition the way I see it within the frame of our just transition as a whole. And then, of course, there might be questions related to the JET IP, which in this country of acronyms needs to then be located within the JET. And then, of course, there's the JET partnership, which in turn needs to be looked at in terms of where it sits in this ecosystem, or in this total systems-based approach to the just transition and then the just energy transition. At the heart of all of this is, of course, the finance question. And without being an expert necessarily on issues related to finance, I'll try to sketch from my perspective where I see finance fitting in, both in terms of international and domestic capital markets, but also in terms of what I think people have an interest in, and that is, what is this notion of blended finance? And then I think, Shafiq, we've been given some guidance with a list, I hope it's here somewhere, about how to navigate this topic, which you will then, after my 2 or 3 minute input, coordinate and facilitate, and I will participate from the floor. This morning's session really sets the scene in terms of what this transition is about. It is a transition which, in South Africa's case, needs to reconcile and integrate, actually, the imperative for dealing with the triple challenges that we as a country, a social economic system face, while at the same time living up to our global commitments as it relates to, and I see not many people this morning use the term common but differentiated contributions to the global well-being. And it's important to place that into context, because some of that then needs to also translate into where, I'm going to use the word liability because we're talking about finance, where the liability for the transition being undertaken successfully actually lies. With respect to the Just Transition Framework, that is something that the PCC spent a lot of time in the course of the last year and a half developing, and then finally tabled it to the President, who then took it through Cabinet. And we now have the Just Transition Framework as the guiding policy and strategic, as well as enunciating principles that all social partners in the country need to look at, in some respects, as a guiding light, a beacon, as a test for whether our transition in South Africa to a climate resilient economy and society is indeed meeting what we consider in South Africa to be imperatives. That just transition framework followed the nationally determined contributions, which got tabled by the country, again, at the recommendation or upon the recommendations of the PCC, and got taken through the cabinet process and then lodged into the UNFCCC system. As Deputy Chair Valley pointed out this morning, it was a range rather than just a simple one-line linear trajectory. And it is those two things together which then, in our opinion as the PCC, give some of the boundaries through which we need to undertake this transition. Finally, we come then to the composition of the pathways that make up the just transition. And here we know that it is mitigation on the one hand, which is primarily premised on decarbonization, and adaptation and resilience, which is much more focused on economic as well as social resilience as climate change impacts get felt, and the need then to ameliorate, in particular, the negative and risk impacts that get felt by both economy and society. However, the just transition framework makes it imperative that both for mitigation as well as adaptation and resilience, there is a very clear justice focus to this transition, and those justices, without going into the details, excuse me, are made up of procedural justice, restorative justice, and distributive justice. And those are really well articulated in terms of what they mean in the just transition framework. Then we come to the just energy transition, and it is the assessed consensus, I would like to think, but certainly from a science and rational analysis point of view, a consensus that given how heavily dependent on carbon emitting as well as other greenhouse gas emitting sources of energy our economy and society are reliant upon, that in essence a decarbonization journey has to necessarily start with energy. And that is a fundamental premise as well that then feeds into the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which I will spend a minute or two without necessarily going into its detail, talk about. So the Just Energy Transition is an essential part of both the mitigation pathways that the PCC sees as being critical to our systems change that is required, as well as adaptation and resiliency that will be associated with our energy system, and in particular the spatial locations that get impacted as the just energy transition unfolds. Within energy, of course, there's the short, medium, and long term. And here we are talking about electricity in the first instance, decarbonizing through a lower reliance on hydrocarbon sources of energy, for example, with respect to transport, and then taking a look going forward with respect to what are the potential alternative and new sources of energy. And here, the just energy transition is really quite a complex systems change that goes to the heart of industrial and economic choices that we have to make, while understanding that energy security as it relates to access to both energy as well as then a reliability of electricity and energy in our total economic system needs to also be addressed. Finally, we come to the JET IP. And the JET IP, I will venture to say, came on the sidelines of the multilateral engagements leading up to COP26. So while they need to be aligned to and consistent with the financial commitments made in the UNFCCC by developed countries, it really is a slightly separate issue. And so I think one of the challenges is going to be, as we assess the efficacy and suitability of the $8.5 billion that was pledged by a group of 5 jurisdictions, the UK, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, and the EU, later joined by the climate investment funds, there's a lot of talk about how much of this is grant, how much of this is concessional, how much of that is deeply concessional, and how much of that is premised to be leveraged by private sector through the capital markets and the financial system. I want to pause here, Shafiq, and say that in summary, we're talking about a just energy transition, which is a subset of the just transition. The just energy transition investment plan that envisages 3 sectors to be transited over a period of 7 or so years, 5 to 7 years. And then, of course, the question of finance, which lies at the heart of what assumptions you make about how many of these pathways, how many of the projects that are contained within the pathways, either assumed or already reasonably well developed, tailored and articulated, and what then is the nature of finance, both in terms of source, domestic or international, commercial or otherwise, donor and philanthropic, and what are the realities of the global financial system right now in order to hasten, in practical terms, a transition while we do deal, and I think it's going to be absolutely necessary to deal with issues of both domestic and global financial architecture, regulations, as well as issues related to whether the financial system itself as a whole needs to be, over a period of time, transformed to be able to assist, facilitate, and finance the transition both in South Africa as well as globally. Thank you.
Thanks, Deepak, and thanks for laying out the what and the why. For us in the finance breakaways about the how will this be done? And I think this morning was also mentioned around this. We have the strategy, but what's going to be the tactics across different spheres of government, society, business, etc. So with that, I also just want to get a sense of who's in the room. So I'm going to just maybe quickly, you don't need a mic, just say I'm labor, civil society, youth, etc. So that we just get a feeling for who will be driving this discussion. So maybe if I can start in front and we'll just move to the back and come back.
As I leave to join the participants.
Yeah, you now.
I'm Deepak, and I'm on the Secretariat of the PCC.
Yeah.
Hi, morning or afternoon, everyone. I'm Mohan. I'm with the Development Bank of Southern Africa.
Shamini Harrington. I'm from the Business Constituency and PCC. Kwezi Kazi, I'm with the PCC Secretariat. I work under DMARC.
I'm from academia.
Hi, I'm Mohammed Lokat. I'm with TIPS, Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies.
I'm Manny Fisser. I'm also from business industrial sectors.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Wandi Lelinda. I'm representing Toyota South Africa.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Vuyisa Tafa from Netlec. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Shana Jardine, Gauteng, Office of the Premier.
Ladies first.
Good day, everyone. I'm Sharon Shabangu with the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs in Mpumalanga.
Hi, Jill Hamilton from Civil Society.
I'm Christelle Murray, South African Forestry Company in the DPE.
Hi, Saki Lameke, International Finance Corporation.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Salas Mlazi. I'm from the Salga.
Good afternoon. I'm Vuyo Kasla from Sasol.
I'm Janice Johnston, and I'm from the JET-IP PMU.
Nah, I'm told I confused the system, so I'll rectify it. Dufikatru from Innovation Africa Foundation. We deal with the smart cities programs, but it's mostly civil society.
Khadi Malova. I am with business, but also representing SMEs in personal capacity.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Tobisa Magazi. I work for the National Treasury.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lerato Dube. I am a climate diplomacy researcher, and I'm here with the YPC.
Dumelang kaofela, my name is Pula Mokhoja. I'm from South African Informal Traders Alliance.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are Raskutuma from Standard Bank.
Good afternoon. My name is Pulane Manale from the Department of Transport.
Morning, everyone. My name is Malabo Patlane from the Department of Transport.
Good morning. My name is Amali Rashka from the PCC, also representing Office of the Premier Mpumalanga as the head of Just Transition for Mpumalanga Province.
Good afternoon. My name is Sandra Koza from Labour, representing Kosatu.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leanne Govinsamy from the Center for Environmental Rights, so civil society.
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Morgan from the African Climate Reality Project and the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa, civil society.
Hi, everyone. My name is Basani Paloi. I'm from the Institute for Economic Justice, civil society. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm TD Lingwasa, and I'm at Section 27, which is civil society. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Matthew Grant. I am representing SAFTU, South African Federation of Trade Unions, so Labour.
Trevor Shagu, SAFTU.
Lakima Chipa from Koktam Pumalanga Municipal Infrastructure.
Hi everyone, my name is Bongani Mabena. I'm representing business. I'm from Impilo Group of companies, and then for this session, we are looking at the energy sector because we are trying to develop solar projects within the townships as well as also within the rural areas. So hopefully this session will give direction to where my organization can get funding from, so we can involve the communities in this just energy transition. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gita Mara. I'm here from the National Business Initiative, so business.
Afternoon, everyone. Joanne Yawich. I'm a PCC commissioner and also from the JET PMU.
And I'm Tebe Mamakoko from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy.
Hello, everybody. My name is Debelo Mudisana, and I'm representing youth at SIRE, specifically the YPC group, so youth, and as well as the Kutuza Foundation, which is civil society.
Sanmonan Kamalam Kolane Twala. I'm from Otandweni After School Program, and I'm here to learn.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mamelo Sinamela. I'm from Webo Wenzel Attorneys, so representing business.
Hi, everybody. I'm Budom Maluleke. I'm from the Public Investment Corporation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Tuani, Department of Mineral Resources and Energy.
Good afternoon. Mek Shabalala, PCC Commissioner from Labour.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matapela Malau, and I'm representing the Development Bank of Southern Africa.
My name is Malcolm from ESCOM. Department of Load Shedding. But I'm sitting here as the capacity of Demand Response, NICOM chairperson for Demand Response. Thank you. Minister from, no.
Christoph Hamann from Rothschild, in other words, business.
Thomas Mguni from Groundwork, civil society.
Okay, thanks. Is that everyone? Okay, there's just one. I was under the impression that it's going to go faster, but I think it's useful because it does indicate that we have a nice cross-section of representatives, which is good, because my worry was the youth, because after this morning I was getting really worried. So maybe we can dig into the issues that we need to discuss. It's around the role of the JET IP and donor funding, and what's your view on that, and what's your recommendations on how those two should be rolled out together, because it depends on donor funding as well as other mechanisms, and we'll deal with the issue of blended finance as well. So maybe I can open the floor for your impressions or your understanding. And we've got PCC members that's been there longer than myself to maybe demystify some of the issues because I think there's some misconceptions out there that needs to be clarified. Anyone with this particular view on that? There's one at the back, yes, sir. Mike, who's going to run with the mic? There. And please, the recorders are just asking you to stand when you speak so that the videographer can capture you as well. Thank you.
Should we not hear from the PCC commissioners first? And maybe National Treasury as well?
Yeah, we're going through that process. But it's not about us. It's a stakeholder engagement as well.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks, team. I think just to kickstart these discussions, because where we are as a country right now, we are not in a stage where we can be talking about things and talking about these pie in the sky ideas that are not available. We need to start moving very quickly because, as they've mentioned, there are solutions which are readily available, but the issue of financing is one of the most cumbersome issues that prevents a lot of projects from actually taking off, especially if we are saying that we want to be able to involve local companies, because if we are honest, most of the beneficiaries of this just energy transitions are multinational companies who are not even yet based in South Africa, or those companies who've got very deep pockets, who benefit mostly from government's procurement energy sales. If you look at the previous bid window, most of the companies that got the most of the pie of those REIPPs is mostly international companies which are fronting with local companies. So where we are as a youth and as South Africans, we cannot afford to not be part of this transition. And I think the biggest challenge that we are facing, especially us as an organization, we've got very brilliant plans, but in terms of the access to funding, it's not really there, because you'll be told that no, we need your balance sheet, we need this, we need this, we need this. But let's face the reality of the matter is that if you want to develop an energy project, you need to be assisted in terms of especially companies which are startups, companies which show that we've got the plans, we've got the technical know-how, but we just have that stumbling block of financing where it's what I think as government, what we should be doing to make sure that we support people like us, that we, instead of grants only being allocated at a much advanced stage, we should look at maybe using grants to facilitate these project preparations, because funders, the money is there. And when I'm talking about the money is there, we've spoken to a lot of people who are willing to fund projects in South Africa, but they all have the same criteria that develop your project first, and once your project is developed, we'll fund it. But now, let's look at the development of that project, how much it really costs to develop an energy project. I mean, we know for a fact that if you were to build a solar farm, a 75 megawatt solar farm, you are going to spend close to about 800, 900 million rands. And to develop that project for you to reach a bankable, feasible stage, you need to spend at least 5% of the total cost to get your project to a fundable stage. So most black people, most youth do not have that type of money to develop this project from their own. I mean, where am I going to get 10 million rands if I'm just from university and I've got a plan? I've got a plan, but I do not have the support from government. Institutions which are there to ensure that they fund young entrepreneurs like ourselves, also they've got their own cumbersome steps that make it very unrealistic for any new player to access this type of funding. They'll tell you that, no, we need this, we need this. So it's as if this money which is there available for us to use as South Africans is specifically earmarked for only those who've got deep pockets. And when I talk about deep pockets, I had a meeting with the IDC, and one of the people, they irritated me in such a way. He says, no, unfortunately, this industry is for the big boys. You need to have money. So now we need to address that to say, how are we able to put that money to be able to develop projects so that young entrepreneurs can develop projects and be able to go look for funding elsewhere. Because the fact of the matter is that the South African government does not have money, but we've got the capacity to tap into international financiers, but most of them will only be able to get involved when your project is properly cooked. And for a project to be properly cooked, you are looking at spending millions of rands, which as a young guy, as a young black guy, you don't have access to that type of money, and you don't even have the support from the government. It's all nice and well for us to come here and say, yeah, we've got this institution, we've got this money, but the reality on the ground is that that money does not filter down to the people who need it most, who will be able to drive this transition for the benefit of the communities.
Okay, thanks for that. So the key issue around project development finance, I think it's a relevant one, because what I'm also hearing is there might be a perception that this is for the big boys, not necessarily filtering down. There's another end at the back.
Thanks, Rodi. I think for me, before we even talk about financing, we need to address the most basic concern. What informed the current plan? Because we've had all of those consultations when the framework was developed, but overnight, all of a sudden, there was an investment plan. So what informed that plan, and why were other stakeholders not properly consulted when this plan was developed? You cannot develop a plan and say, I'm going to consult. What informed that plan, so that we begin our discussions to say, do we need to revisit this plan such that all stakeholders have a clear role and clear input to develop this plan?
Yeah, and I agree, because I think one of the comments also made this morning that no plan is set in stone. It is something that gets us on the way, and part of the interactions going forward is also to look at some of these things. There's another, okay, so 1, 2, 3. Can we keep it brief, please? So we've got a whole shopping list to go through. Lady on my left-hand side.
Thanks, Rudy. Is it possible for you to maybe tell us what your plan for this conversation is going to look like, so we can structure our responses accordingly? Is this kind of preliminary thoughts that you're fielding from us here? Are you going to follow the outline and the framework of the JET IP in terms of like headings? How much time do we have? Because I'm really concerned that we may not get into some of the details that we would like to get into, and some of it requires responses in order for us to ask further questions. So just appreciate a bit of a roadmap for this conversation.
Okay, Deepak will assist.
I'm going to...
You come here.
So, this National Colloquium in the first instance was driven by a need to finalize the PCC's inputs after stakeholder consultations on the energy mix. And so you will have noticed that a lot of the breakaway groups, other than this one, are looking at aspects of the energy mix which the PCC intends to submit to the President once that has been completed as part of the IRP revision plan. We wanted a group breaking away on the issues of finance in order to unpack what the critical blockages might be with respect to financing both the just transition as well as the just energy transition. The group was, this working group was not fundamentally premised on the JET IP. The JET IP, as those of you who might have participated in the ongoing stakeholder engagements over the last 2 months or so, would have made your inputs there. That set of stakeholder feedback is now being compiled independently, also for submission to the President as a discharge of his request to the PCC to essentially conduct stakeholder consultations around the JET IP and give him feedback. We're also hoping that this session will go into further informing the PCC's own views on the JET IP. And so the President also invited the PCC, after having heard stakeholders and after considering its own analysis work as well as perspectives on both decarbonization and the just transition framework, as well as the NDP, then as the PCC make known its views on the JET IP. So in a sense, this is a conversation around how do we unlock financing for the just transition, but the JET in particular. Of course, we can't avoid conversation and even critique if that's what participants feel is necessary on the JET IP, both in terms of the JET IP's stance on sectors as well as assumptions with respect to the composition of the JET IP package, the finance package of 8.5 billion. But I would perhaps appeal that if we become fixated on the 8.5 billion, then we're losing sight of the JET IP's estimate of the need for the entire transition, which amounts to 98 point something billion dollars. And so we were hoping that this group, in deliberation, would start looking at what the potential sources, blends, as well as instrumentation might look like with respect to raising both domestically and perhaps globally the balance of the 98.6 billion.
Thanks, yeah. So thanks for that, because also, and we understand that we want to talk about the mechanisms, the how did this happen, etc. But we need to get into the what if we have the money and how are we going to get the money? What do we need to do? What's the capability at the local level? What's the institutional arrangement? How is Treasury gonna deal with these things in budgets going forward? That's what we want to unlock in this discussion, and we appreciate where you want to take the discussion, but maybe yeah, and so there's a and then okay, but please take note of our appeal so that we can take the discussion forward in terms of financing the transition.
How's it, guys? So yeah, I'm going to keep my submission brief, and yeah, let's cut to the chase and not talk around in circles. So anyway, my contribution will be around 3 T's, right? The first comment will be about time. The JET IP is supposed to be implemented now 2023 to 2027, and that's for the first tranche. Where's the money? Where's the projects? Where's it all going? Why are we still engaging in stakeholder discussions when projects should be on the ground ready? The second T will be transparency. As the gentleman said, where's the transparency in this? Government, and I'm sad that Rudy isn't here. They talk about a 9 gigawatt pipeline of projects in the private sector. What exactly are those projects? Who's doing it? If it's Sasol, tell us what they're doing with the 1.5 gigawatts. If it's Anglo-American, tell us what they're doing. The third T is transmission, and it gets technical. Maybe that's the fourth T. Anyway, why is so much of the money going to transmission? My understanding of this is that we need to enable a just transition in South Africa. And the just transition is located in Mpumalanga. That's where all the coal mine workers are going to be losing their jobs. So why are we spending 90% of this money building out transmission lines in the middle of the Karoo to create jobs for the flora and fauna there? It's not, it doesn't make sense. The mines are going to be closed in Mpumalanga, next to us here. That's where the money should go to, especially for the first tranche. And I'm really sad that the rank profiteering of the IPP environment, that they've not created a single project in Mpumalanga. It's only the private sector now with Seriti Green that's actually building wind farms there. Where's the imaginary that's being built into the people in Mpumalanga? No wonder there's so much opposition to it. If I can add one more T, it's the right path. Are we going down the right path? There's a lot of emphasis on green hydrogen and so on, talking about Sasol building in Buchubai and this happening and that happening. Where's Buchubai? It's in the north. It's in the Northern Cape. It's so far away from where the people are and where the jobs are, and it's not even properly bankable. It's still in feasibility. From my reading of it, Transnet will be building that stuff. They'll be enabling the works there. It's for manganese exports. It's not for green hydrogen. Why are we greenwashing this entire exercise? And yeah, just to summarize, 3 T's: time. We need to do it now. We're in load shedding. We're in stage 6 load shedding. Where's the money? Secondly, transmission. Why is most of the money going to transmission when it should be going to generation and just transition projects and reskilling and so on? Thirdly, transparency. There's a lot of smoke and daggers going around here. Big corporates, large corporates, they're doing their own thing. Where's the concerted approach to climate policy, to industrial policy, to the legal frameworks that underpin this, to the financing that we're talking about. This is money that we're going to be tying ourselves into for multiple years, for many years. It's time that we know about it, and it's also time that we go down this path and do things that need to be done. Thank you.
Thanks for that, but can we appeal again, keep it to the financing, because there's other breakaways that speaks to localization and some of the other issues. Otherwise, we're just gonna go in circles. We need to talk about, do we have the local government ability to use the money, to generate income, to pay for some of these things, etc. That's where we need to take the discussion, colleagues. Otherwise, we're just gonna rehash what's been discussed and argued about in other breakaway sessions. So let's try and keep it around some of the financing issues. We understand some of your frustrations, but also let's stay focused. There's now so many hands that I've lost that the lady in front was hand been up for a while. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So when we talk about blockages, it feels to me very much as if we should be talking about public finance reform for South Africa. So I'm going to give you some examples. It's harder to look at my book while I use the microphone. So, for instance, and I think we shouldn't forget the corruption issue. I don't know how we're going to build the trust back in South Africa, but we have a real trust deficit, and I believe that even internationally, it is something that we should be looking at if we're trying to raise the finance. Some of the public finance reforms we need to rethink our fossil fuel subsidies. So even the green hydrogen project, for many of us in civil society, that looks like another fossil fuel reform, another fossil fuel subsidy. So that is something we're really worried about. Even our green taxonomy is not as progressive as it could be. It really could be much stronger and much more taking into consideration things like planetary boundaries. Taxation reforms. We need to tax our fossil fuel companies more because of their externalities. And so that's something that we should be considering. Again, I'm going to reiterate what some people here have said. We are concerned about the green hydrogen project in the JET-P. We don't feel like it was a very transparent process. There aren't even civil society members on the green hydrogen roadmap project. I think that's about all for now. Our policies are still not aligned. So DMRE is sitting in the room. We have very few people from DMRE here. But we need to rethink our policies. We can't start exploiting gas in South Africa. Yep. It's just too risky for us from a financial perspective.
Thanks, and I think that's the type of input that we are seeking that will enrich the document. There's another hand here. And I recognize at the back. Yes, sir.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Again, my name is Mohan from the DBSA. Our mandate is to fund sustainable infrastructure, and about 40% of the funding we do is in the energy sector, and about 2/3 of that here in South Africa. We've been funding a lot of the renewable energy projects from the start of the IPP program from 2010. So we've got a lot of insight around this. What we're seeing now around the financing is that actually there are a lot of transactions that are starting to come through. So maybe I can provide a little bit around how that's being financed as well, and then speak about what's working, especially with the policy changes that the president has brought forward in the last 2 years, and then look at what are additional areas that that we'd see as a financing institution needs to come through. So one of them is the fact that there are a significant number of renewable energy projects in particular that are starting to come through. As an example of those, we know the various bid window rounds from the IPP programs, right? That those are starting to get closed. There were some challenges during the COVID period about the pricing of those. In fact, the pricing was so low that the sponsors weren't able to get them funded post-COVID because the prices of a lot of the equipment and others had gone up in that time. But what we are seeing is those are starting to get closed. This is bid window 5 and hopefully bid window 6 as well, plus the risk mitigation round. And across those, we as the DBSA have funded a number of the projects, but so have primarily the commercial banks. And one of the things we're seeing there is the pricing is actually getting very, very tight, especially for senior debt and for mezzanine debt. And the reason is it's actually a sign of confidence from the markets, from the capital markets, around the technologies and the sponsor groups and the government standing behind those programs as well, which is why the pricing is getting tight. Pricing getting tight means that the tariffs are actually coming down, which will be beneficial for all of us in South Africa that pay for our energy. Beyond the government-led IPP program, since the changes that the presidency has brought forward in the last year and a half, especially around increasing the size of the private-to-private projects, right? What are commonly, there's a terminology we call CNI offtake, which stands for commercial and industrial offtake. Since then, and I think that's the 9 gigawatts of projects that the gentleman was referring to, a tangible example of a project that we've been involved in getting to financial close at the end of last year was the Tronox transaction. It was a 200 megawatt solar PV project. The 200 megawatts of solar are going to be built in the Northwest, where there is transmission grid availability. And it's going to be offtake by Tronox, which is a large mineral processing company. The DBSA was involved in the transaction. We provided, the total value of the transaction was about 4.5 billion rands, and we provided a little over 1 billion rands of that. The other 3 billion came mostly from South African commercial banks, right? So it was majority funded by commercial banks. And it has majority black South African ownership as well, albeit from African Rainbow Energy and Power, which obviously has a solid sponsor behind it as well, and the Solar Group. So, what's interesting about that is to understand now that there's a lot of private capital that's also moving towards just funding private-to-private projects. Mm-hmm. And this was done also off of 20-year loan funding, which means the capital markets are very comfortable with a lot of these type of larger CNI-type projects. And the key elements there was, one, it was the quality of the sponsor group, but also the fact that there was a long-term offtake being provided by a big mineral processing company, right? So those are projects now that are also getting a lot of funding. There's another project we've just approved, and we're getting to financial close on a 100 megawatt solar PV project, also again, which is going to be based in the Northwest, also with mining offtake. And once that's closed, then the public information will be provided about it. Basically, the way that the financial institutions work is we only provide information on projects that have gotten to the commitment stage, right? Till that happens, the information isn't brought to the public, into the public. And there's a second round of those same projects that's coming through in the same area as well. So that's just one entity, the DBSA. And so what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of solar projects in particular that are coming through the pipeline that are getting funded. The key element, though, is those are with bigger companies acting as the offtake, because they're able to provide 20-year, offtake, and something that we as funders can have comfort around. Yeah. That then speaks to the question of, okay, so then where are the gaps, right? And I'm sorry, I know I'm taking a bit of time, but I just wanted to provide a bit of color. One of the areas is we want to get a lot of smaller companies to also be able to get the benefits of renewable energy. The challenge is it's difficult for them to provide the same 20-year offtakes. So one of the challenges is how do you allow a scenario where companies can provide 3 to 5 year offtake only, but we as funders can still provide longer tenor funding that's needed to get those projects to close. And that requires guarantees to come through either from development institutions like the DBSA or the IFC or others to give commercial banks some level of comfort. But what we think is over time, energy will become like, a mobile phone, right? Where you're signing 2-year, 3-year contracts, if any, but the assets that are needed are still being funded through long tenors because people have comfort in funding a Vodacom or an MTN or others. Right now, you don't have those kind of energy trading companies, but that's the future that we see happening. And that's just the generation. I haven't even spoken on the investments needed on transmission and new technologies as well, but just wanted to give a bit of color around what we see happening in the market today.
Good, thanks for that. I think it's useful. There was a lady at the back, somewhere in the middle here with the glasses.
Oh, yeah, the thing is, we all have glasses.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Rudy. So, in terms of my input, right, there's the 8.5 billion, and then there is the 98 billion US dollars, I think. Correct, Divak? I'm looking at you. The remaining, right? And so the question then is, you know, will we be able to mobilize this amount of money based on the framework of the JIP, the financing framework that has been set of raising that amount of money, given that it's part of this, right? Because you can't just create a green taxonomy thinking that the financial sector will just respond and like just integrate your taxonomy into the pricing mechanism. You know, like you can't, what can I say? You cannot appeal to their consciousness. There are other types of banking institutions, shadow banks, private equity, where we are seeing the fact that there is an expansion still of fossil fuel globally, right? And of course, there's an expansion of renewables, but that is driven by a particular orientation of our global financial architecture, where you have shadow banks, you have private equity that are, in a sense, undermining, that are operating outside of regulatory modalities so that they can actually continue to make these types of transactions that are fossil fuel based, that undermine then the growth of renewables, right? And this particular JIP is not a disruptor of that, right? It does not disrupt that. In fact, it is setting this high ambition of raising this money, right? And it will struggle to, because more money is actually being channeled towards fossil fuels, right? And so yes, so basically what can be done, there are things that can be done within our macroeconomic framework that can actually help support this particular ambition that have not been explored within the JIP, right? And yeah, we hope to discuss those.
Okay, thanks. The lady with the glasses. And welcome.
Okay. Thanks.
Colleagues, can we keep it brief,
Yeah.
please?
Yeah,
We're running
thanks. Just to start off with saying, you know, this JIP is a very important deal, and I don't think that we are fixated on it for no reason. I think it sets precedent, and I think, especially for civil society, we're looking at this deal and we're saying, how we handle this deal tells us how we're going to handle climate finance in the future coming into this country. So that's just what I wanted to say before my question. But I have a very practical question on what is the role of development finance institutions? So your development banks, your DBSAs, your African development banks, how will they, you know, play a role in this deal? How is the money coming into the country? We know that some money has come into the country, or there's confusion around that because we've been told that some of the loans have already come into the country. I ask this because I attended the AFDB 10-year strategy planning meeting about 2 weeks ago, where the JETP was barely mentioned, and there was no clarity around whether, you know, is this all of this money going to National Treasury? Is some of it coming through DFIs? There's just no clarity, and a similar question applies to the IPG. What role do they play once the money has flowed into the country? Mm-hmm. Do they have any, you know, say in how the money is invested? Do they have any say in, you know, in this implementation plan that we've been told is being written? Just clarity on how the money is coming in and what are the roles of not just government but the IPG as well as DFIs.
Okay, good. There's a gentleman here in front.
I think
let's try and give everyone a chance, and because I've got lots of hands. And there's the guy from, I think, ESCOM. And yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so maybe jumping a little bit, but addressing some of the question and just what the gentleman from the DBSA said as well. I think a lot of the corporate PPAs are still written with a REAP in mind. So there's risk allocation from the IPPs, very little risk, 20-year offtake agreements, etc. And my sort of issue with that is, why do we need 20-year offtake agreements? Because it's never going to be a stranded asset. We heard this morning from the minister that we have to act now. We also heard this morning that we don't have enough energy. Now, the capacity that I spoke about, 32, 33 gigawatt peak, that's a ceiling that we've created ourselves. I believe if there's more energy, the capacity will be higher. If you have enough energy, if Eskom has enough energy, then our peak will go up to 40, 35, 40, 45. So this whole notion of a bank having to have an offtake agreement for 20 years locked in because it might be a stranded asset, it's not going to be a stranded asset. We also heard this morning that Eskom said, that someone said that Eskom has not reached cost effectivity yet. There's a big variable portion that's going to be fixed in future. We're probably going to see tariff increases coming through. So you also haven't hit your ceiling in terms of PPAs pricing. It's probably a floor at the moment. So there will be a liberated market. There will not be a stranded asset. So commercial banks or development banks need to take on a little bit more risk in this. Unfortunately, that gentleman is the only pull at this stage. There's very few companies that are pulling commercial banks. You did say it will happen in future, but that will take too long. You need to push it from your side. We need to have a push mindset, and maybe some of that this funding can go towards that. But to push this market in, not to wait for it to pull us in, because we need to act now, and I believe we need to take on a little bit more risk.
Thanks. I think that's a great contribution. Eskom?
Yeah. Stage 6 load shedding. No. So my role is part of being the demand response, and I think there's a whole fixation around supply options. I think there needs to be a clear realization: the less demand we use, the less wastage we are, the less supply, dirty coal or green coal you should be using. So I think there's no real consideration for the demand side options. I think we need to consider that when you manage a power system, you manage supply and demand. So we're fixating ourselves on one side of the equation and not focusing on the other side of the equation. And I think I would like to speak to the gentleman. I think the more we use electrons, the more we need to generate electrons. So I think the conversation needs to be turned around: how do we become energy-wise, more energy efficient in what we do? How do we unlock and bring the social partners and small contractors along is critical for me, because I think if we don't bring distributors along, we're spending a lot of money investing on big supply options and not spending enough and looking at distributors to actually managing the demand, because the distributors is able to work with local suppliers and contractors and to unlock that demand options available. So I think there needs to be due consideration by IPG around demand options, and let's talk about supply options.
Yeah. No, that's coming from the water space. That's 100% correct. And now, of course, also how do you stimulate that part of the economy as well? And and the question and also remains that, and so there's a lot of questions that speaks around the macroeconomic, how we're going to fund, but the role of, for example, National Treasury, what should that role be? How do they incorporate some of these ambitions into budgeting for the next year, MTF and so forth? So maybe I know there's colleagues from Treasury. Is there any plans, and maybe just also highlight what that role should be, and also from the other stakeholders, what they think that role should be. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. I feel we are being thrown under the bus somehow, but I will really give my best effort to respond to some of the issues and all. I think many of you might be aware that in recent time, and I think, in fact, if I were to go back as far back as 2019, the National Treasury has been really trying to respond to some of these critical issues of what is our role in the broader discussion and discourse on issues of climate change? As a result, we have set up our own coordinating structures internally where we're looking and trying to interrogate what should be our focus areas in response to these issues and all. We've set up a climate change working group for one. I just want to give a context around coordination first before I come to some of the nitty-gritty issues that have been asked by colleagues. We've similarly also set up a working group, and some of you might be aware, on issues around the green taxonomy. We've similarly also, as a result of having set up the JP, set up also a working group that specifically looks into issues of climate financing. Also, as a response to also the establishment of the Just Transition Framework, we've also tried to emulate our own or stimulate our own structures, activate our own structures internally, where we're also specifically looking on issues around the just transition and how we actually support that broadly, and especially when it comes to the requirements of decoupling the economy. Be that as it may, this is, it's not a work that can be defined exclusively by the National Treasury. Obviously, we do collaborate with the likes of PCC and other institutions, and especially also some of the the policy departments in defining some of our program of action. What I wanted to specifically respond to around the role of the National Treasury. The National Treasury, as many would be aware, is a critical institution in terms of budgeting and issues around the setting of the economic policy of the country, and also when it comes to generally making sure that there is a solvency and also management of financial risks that are faced by the country generally. And these are things that are actually enshrined in our mandate beyond the just transition discourse that we are currently trying to frame it under. But what I think is quite crucial for colleagues to bear in mind is that the National Treasury is an active player in the policy discourse, and especially from a budgetary and financial planning of the country. And we interface, of course, quite broadly in terms of the system, in terms of the intergovernmental fiscal system and arrangements of government when it comes to such. Linked to that, the National Treasury is quite a key player in terms of international and economic development, as well as also really interfacing with some of the developmental finance institutions, whether you're looking at it from a domestic or international point of view. So I think broadly, these are some of the instruments, if I were to define, that are available to the National Treasury. When it comes to some of the specificities of the issues that have been raised today, there was a question that was asked, I think it was asked by Jill, on broader public finance reforms that need to be pursued by the National Treasury, and I do agree with you. Especially in the context of our taxes, there is a lot of reforms that we need to pursue in the space, and there is an acknowledgement, at least from our side, and especially after having concluded a diagnostic where we were really interrogating these issues as to how are we going to take these issues on board. One of the issues that we've highlighted as part of those public finance reforms is that we do need to engage in these environmental fiscal reforms, specifically looking into how we can review our existing taxation system. How do we, for one, review some of the existing incentive arrangements, and especially when it comes to addressing these inefficiencies that are linked to fossil fuels. One of the other areas that we are, I think many of the colleagues would be aware that there is an ongoing process around reviewing our carbon tax. There is a planned process around that. So those are the broader agenda issues, and especially when it comes to this particular critical reform that we have introduced in terms of the carbon tax. When it comes to the issues about the green taxonomy, I think one of the colleagues actually did mention that in the reference. I was trying to listen quite carefully while also trying to frame my thoughts around how I'm going to respond to these issues and all. There's this broader need for engagements and collaboration with the likes of central banks and all. And I do wish to confirm to colleagues that when we did develop the green taxonomy, it was actually quite a collaborative exercise between ourselves and the likes of the Reserve Bank, working with financial institutions and regulators, etc. So that was part of a collaborative exercise and all. What we must admit, of course, is that the institutionalization of that process hasn't really taken shape. And you would also know in that in terms of developing the green taxonomy, it's still on a voluntary basis. It's not a compulsory arrangement at all. There was also a concern about the fact that it's not a progressive tool somehow. But what we do need to equally acknowledge is that when we developed the taxonomy, it did actually try to follow as based some of the existing international practice and all. It might not be perfect, but it did as part of the taxonomy and the typology that was actually used to inform that exercise and all. What we are hoping to do as part of the ongoing effort around the taxonomy itself is to do a series of stress testing and seeing how we can actually integrate this further, obviously working with the likes of the Reserve Bank and some of the industry players in the regard, and assisted by the likes of DFFE. What I do also want to acknowledge really in that in recent time we have been weakened in terms of capacity, and particularly in this area, in that some of the colleagues that were leading this work have since left the employ of Treasury, but we are trying to build that capacity afresh. But I think I do want to allay fears in that the work will continue, and there is a way, a planning method around institutionalizing these issues. I do also want to come back to one of the issues that was raised initially, particularly around the issues of project preparation support. Again, as part of this exercise that we have gone into great lengths to try to do as the National Treasury, which is really trying to look into some of our gap areas in terms of delivery. One of the things that we have specifically outlined as part of the work that we need to take forward is this issue around how do we incorporate resilience rating systems into the South African infrastructure planning processes. And examples of activities that we are wishing to include as part of that exercise is also looking into updating the existing capital project planning rules and appraisal guidelines to include specific components that are responding to how we integrate resilience into the capital project screening processes. The National Treasury also is, through our city support project, is also looking into reviewing some of the city's infrastructure delivery management systems, and also with the focus of integrating and strengthening some of the climate risks framing when it comes to issues of infrastructure delivery and management. And of course, many of the colleagues might be aware that we have already initiated a process around updating some of the catalytic land development guidelines, which then respond specifically to the need by metros on this assistance for project preparation facility and all. Of course, this work is also quite complementary to some of the work that's led by DFIs, such as the DBSA, and we do work quite collaboratively with the likes of DBSA and IDC in the regard, in terms of really providing additional grant assistance to metros and identify some of these catalytic projects that are required, and provision of transactional advisory support to metros in relations to project facilitation and support. I wanted to conclude, I think the issues pertaining to the collaboration on the JETP specific, I think Deepak will cover that, just so I don't abuse the platform, but we do work quite collaboratively, but I will come in if there is a need to elaborate further on that. But I wanted to end on this. There is this, obviously, in the framing of the issues of what the National Treasury could potentially do and all, there's an acknowledgement, of course, from our side, because we do also actively participate in the UNFCCC-related processes, and we're forming part of the delegations that go to COP conferences as well. While we acknowledge, of course, that a significant amount of them, the resources that are needed to drive our climate resilience and climate decarbonization agenda needs to come from international sources and all, what we are also trying to do domestically is to also look into our own existing mechanisms from a public finance point of view, because there is a need, of course, to provide leveraging financing that can actually assist in terms of public investments, and also de-risking some of the existing projects and all. What we have done in recent time, we have also tried to develop a climate budget taking framework that would be applied across the different spheres of government, which will then precisely then look into where in the system is the money sitting, and especially when it comes to providing this complementary funding that is needed from a domestic point of view, in line with the efforts that we are putting out there as a country when it comes to bilateral and multilateral financing. And considering that there is going to be this need going forward for us to also have these blended financing mechanisms and also defining this climate financing architecture. So these are the things that we think as the National Treasury, it's not sufficient to just say there's not enough money in the system. It requires a step further where we actually have systems and processes that we can use to actually identify and classify climate-related expenditures to actually develop a case around these issues. Complementary to that, I think there is a broader need quite broadly in the system for us to actually develop this sort of mechanisms as a country. For instance, when it comes to the reporting around the biannual updated reports, we do need to give this flavoring of where in the system is the money sitting, what sort of categories and what sort of interventions and objectives is that the funding that exists in the system currently supporting. Quite key, because there is really this weakening in terms of our public financing systems and our ability as a country to identify and mobilize additional public resources. We do need systems such as the CBT to justify how we can actually reprioritize, how we can realign the existing resources to fund some of these emerging priorities, especially that are related to just transition and building resiliency in the economy broadly as well. Thank you so much.
I think that's an excellent overview of what's happening at that level. Certainly educational for me as well. But before we go, I just want to pick up something, because you also said once the grant funding goes to the local level, and one of the questions that we've been asking ourselves, do we have that institutional capacity at the local government? Maybe you can hear from local government, and we all live in a ward and so forth. Do we have that capacity to use and to work through some of these models, try some of these models in terms of for how do we generate income, how do we finance some of these schemes? And we know there's a couple, and of course when we think local government, not always metros, but the other spheres of local government where there might be an issue. Maybe just a sense of what's that institutional capacity. Is it there? Does it need to be strengthened? Do we need a mechanism to assist with the issues at that level? Anyone from local government? Let me go in front and then we go to the back. I'm trying to give everyone a chance, so if you've spoken before, I'm just going to make you second. Okay. Or the back of the, sorry, sir. Okay. Yeah. So you can go.
Okay, no.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
No, thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. What we've done is that as local government, we have submitted comprehensive inputs in terms of our views around the investment plan. And of course, we do welcome that. You'll realize that one of the greatest assets that we have as a local government is the distribution network. And as we speak now, there is a lot of things that needs to be done in terms of maintenance, in terms of upgrade. You go to City of Tshwane, they will tell you that the network is congested as you speak. So they wouldn't be able to absorb additional capacity. Yet we talk of new generation capacity in a network that is congested as we speak. Nonetheless, we welcome the 319 billion investment needs that is in the investment plan for the local government, and we believe it's going to help a lot in that regard. We also talk of, in this transition, wheeling. And you know that wheeling only happens in the distribution space, of course transmission too, but in the distribution space, that's where we are as local government together with ESCOM. And that's where the issues around maintenance and upgrade of network comes in, as well as new network, distribution network. And that's where we say, yes, indeed, we are happy with the investment plan as is, and we believe it's going to go a long way in enabling the wheeling part of the transition. Talk of capacity. Yes, you have got a point, you are right. Municipalities do differ in terms of size, metro, secondary, smaller municipalities. And we've made it clear in our inputs we submitted in writing, by the way, to the PCC. We've been meeting Deepak and colleagues many times. We made it clear that, yes, we do need a lot of capacity built clear, and we do support the transition. We do support the investment plan as is, and we believe it's going to go a long way in this transition. You need to remember that local government or municipalities are well positioned to drive a local sustainable energy transition. Therefore, the support is needed big time. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, so maybe part of the finance need to go to creating institutions that need to deal with some of these issues. Labor? Sorry, I miss you. You're sitting like this.
No, thanks, Chair. Just a quick remark before I begin. One is that I think you've been giving a lot of the speakers from government a lot of their time. And I think these are people who must come here to listen to our questions and our comments, not really to take much of the space here. Because these processes, they have them somewhere. In fact, as the previous speaker was questioning, where was the investment plan drawn? And it's because it was drawn by people in government. So if you give them enough time or much time, you are depriving us of an opportunity to question and make inputs into this. Just few questions. Or the first question, rather, there's a second preamble. Is this discussion, because I see on the, on the program, I see that when we leave here, we're going to plenary, and after plenary, at the end of the second session, we will go back to plenary where there will be a declaration. Does this mean all of this will be then taken as a note for this investment plan, the financing plan of the JET IP, and of course of the transition? Are they going to be taken forward as the note from the consultation with labor and civil society and other groupings? So that question can be answered, Chair, before you go to another speaker. But let me make my inputs in relation to these financing plans which have been outlined. The first one is that we are against privatization as the South African Federation of Trade Unions. And I think even COSATU, because I know we communicate a lot. And because we are against privatization, the question of where financing comes from is of utmost importance for us. Now, in the JET IP, which is part of this discussion, there is a premise at the beginning which, under public finance, that premise seeks to paint a picture that because of fiscal unsustainability, whatever that is, therefore they are going to have to go and look for different financing methods. And some of those financing methods, at least they mention in the succeeding sentences after that. It's PPP, which is private-public partnership, and then of course they speak about taxation. Now, we think that the problems here is the failure to appreciate the monetary sovereignty of this, the monetary sovereign system that this country has, in which the allyship between the central bank, the South African Reserve Bank, and Treasury can really be able to finance a lot of this, and not a lot actually, all of this, without any hurdle. Now, you create this impression that you do not have money, so that you go outside of the country to seek money. And Utsile in there made mention of some few points relating to finance, which I also want to actually emphasize here, because in addition to this, let me start with the sovereign debt. There are financing principles which you say you adhere to. And one of those financing principles is that the sovereign debt will be more attractive than any other form of debt. Not any other, but most forms of debt. But what you have embarked on, raising 8.5 billion US dollars, which would mostly be denominated in the foreign currency, the US dollar, would be compromising the very principle of sovereign debt. It would compromise the monetary sovereignty of this particular country, because any debt that you accumulate that is not denominated in your currency, you would not be able to meet its expenditure, especially with the volatile forex market which we see today as a result of inflation, interest rates, and all of that, which unfortunately increases the amount of debt. For instance, if you look at the ESCOM debt, it has been increasing not because the World Bank has increased the figures, but because of the volatility in the forex market, which have led to the devaluation of the rand. Now, if you go outside to go and borrow more money, get money in concessional loans and all of that, what you are saying to us is that you are trapping this country in a problem that only the members of the Eurozone would have experienced a few years ago, the sovereign debt crisis. And this country, because it has monetary sovereign system, cannot experience sovereign debt crisis, but it will have that sovereign debt crisis because you continue to go outside to borrow money in in currencies that are not issued by the Central Bank of South Africa, which is the South African. So this is the first point, that you are actually, by having followed the route you have followed, you are first and foremost you are tramping on the very principle you established in the very ZIP. This is the first point I'm making. The second point is that this model of PPPs, we've seen with the saga of Thabo Bester, that these things, that PPP models are actually a way in which these private companies merely seek the state to assist them to underwrite their risks so that they can reap profits, the socialization of risks and the reaping of profits on the side. And in this instance, you are following that very logic. But the question is, and to a certain extent, it exposes a little bit of hypocrisy on your part, because if you are saying there is fiscal unsustainability, meaning you do not have the capacity to meet certain spending obligations as a nation, why would you then go and underwrite some of the risks, some of the monies and investments which would be coming and invested in some of these particular plans? Where would you get that money if you are indeed in a fiscal crisis? Let me go to another one. You mentioned the independent central bank, but there you make very not distortions, but omissions. And I think these omissions were deliberate. You say that you only mention the independence of the central bank insofar as its use of the monetary policy of intervening, for instance, in price stabilization through interest rates is concerned. But you fail to mention that the central bank has the power to issue money into creation and ensure that it set up some of the spending credit facilities to spend and finance some of the needs which are required at this particular moment. So we have, in the labor consultation, submitted and made these submissions very substantively. And we are repeating them here for the benefit of other stakeholders, that we are opposed, first and foremost, to the financing methods which we have set forth on the basis of the reasons I've already given. Of course, they are not that substantive here. But secondly, that we must expose the hypocrisy on the part of Treasury, that they are experiencing fiscal unsustainability or fiscal risks, yet they are willing to de-risk the investment of certain private companies. That thirdly, you are saying you are only appreciating the powers of the central bank insofar as interest rates are concerned, but are not willing to appreciate the powers of the central bank to issue new money and finance this value-creating process, which, of course, will not be inflationary, because the only limitation that Treasury and the central bank has to consider in spending money or creating money, spending money into creation, would be inflationary risks. Will this expenditure lead or stoke flames of inflation? If it will not stoke flames of inflation, why should you stop from spending money into that creation? And the coordination between the two institutions, which are very powerful, Treasury and the central bank, would go a long way in ensuring that we are able to move and finance as fast as we could, that this small businesses, which we have supported for quite some time, but with the center played by ESCOM in that particular process, that such particular expenditure is provided for by government without having to go outside to look for money that in turn you will just come and underwrite. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. And most of your questions, I think, is already encapsulated into your concern around some of these things. Whether the declaration this afternoon is a nod, I'm not sure. Deepak, you just yes or no?
The declaration this afternoon is mainly, as I explained earlier, around what our input as a PCC is going to be after stakeholder consultation on the energy. With respect to the JET IP, which a lot of attention is paid to here, I've indicated that we've already had stakeholder engagements and an independent report of stakeholder, apologies, and an independent report of stakeholder feedback to the President is currently being prepared, and this National Colloquium will be the final input into a finalization of that report to the President. But we will also, through the stakeholder engagements, take a view as the PCC on what our recommendations, after listening to stakeholders as well as considering other issues, whether they be NDC, whether they be the Just Transition Framework. I need to say that all of that is going to be within the existing fiscal framework and within the existing economic policy that drives the country. I'm afraid the critique of the economy is slightly beyond the scope of the PCC's mandate.
Yep. Thanks. Yes?
Okay. Thank you. So I'll be really quick because most of the points that I was considering have been covered by Labour very well. So I just have like one question. So it is maybe also to Treasury, is that with the funding or the way that the JET IP or like the conversation around it is about debt. And well, it's mostly about debt and like concessional loans. But then currently one of the issues, or often Treasury says that the reason we're not receiving enough adequate funding allocated towards, like in terms of budgeting, allocated towards education and healthcare is because, well, how do I put it? So the expenditure or budgeting for education and healthcare over the past 10 years has been declining or increasing at a decreasing rate, whereas the interest on debt, so interest on expenditure, has been ballooning and is the highest growing item on the budget. However, with this, so the implications of that is that education and healthcare are receiving less funding because of the debt that, or the interest on debt that the country has. And so our concern is that this has an impact on the realization of the constitutional rights to education and healthcare, but then it seems like we're taking on even more debt. So I just wondered like how if we are already struggling with interest on debt in the current fiscal framework, what interventions or what considerations are there to ensure that this does not continue so that we can continue to have education and healthcare realization, especially for the most marginalized communities moving forward in this context? So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Point taken. Yes, sir?
I just want to make a quick, maybe just an idea, because we are talking about looking for money. So I think as a country, as you know, guys, in business and even in your own personal lives, you first need to use what you have before you can attract investments. So from where I'm sitting, there's a couple of mechanisms that can be used to actually fund money that can develop projects. Why doesn't Treasury and SARS and all other stakeholders maybe introduce sort of like a tax deductible mechanism for businesses to contribute, to say, because we are in this crisis, why don't we donate a certain percentage, and this percentage that we're donating becomes tax deductible? Because we know most people don't like to pay tax. So if you introduce such a mechanism to say that we want to raise a certain amount of money that will allocate this money for project preparation, for preparing assets that can be used in terms of generating income, why don't we use that mechanism to say for the next 5 years, we'll set up a fund like we did during COVID, where even normal people can donate to this fund, knowing that this fund is the fund that will be used for companies or for government to get us out of this electricity crisis. And if I donate, then I'll get a tax rebate or a tax deduction, because this is for the country. It's not for, like I get tax deductions from my retirement annuities. Why doesn't then we introduce the same mechanisms for a specific amount of years? Because people, it's a fact, big companies are finding clever ways to get money out because everything is collapsing. But if we say, let's set up a fund or for the next 5 years, and companies donate, or individuals donate, and the money is used to develop projects. Because I can tell you right now, even in the crisis that we are facing, we are still an investable destination, because wherever there's a crisis, there's opportunities to make money. That's why if you look at most countries, they are looking at South Africa right now to say, how can we get in to actually invest in projects that can assist this country in its electricity crisis. So maybe that's a discussion that can be had to say, let's sit down and say, can't we say maybe if companies donate to a certain percentage, like we are doing when you donate to NGOs, where you get a tax certificate to say, I've donated to this NGO, and this is my tax deduction for the year. We can use the same mechanism. We can also take the stance of Norway and other countries in developing a sovereign wealth fund. Because just like they've mentioned, we don't have to be borrowing money while we've got so many natural assets that we can use to our benefit. The only problem that I see is because there's so many vested interests in this thing, there will be a very big resistance to developing a sovereign wealth fund which can be used to fund our developmental needs as a country. Norway is far ahead. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they've got sovereign wealth funds from their natural resources which are funding their own programs as a country. So if we are able to develop assets which will be investable, then let's do that. Let's pump in money so that we've got assets to use. You can't just generate money from nowhere. Otherwise, that's why we are in a debt trap, because we cannot use the assets that we've got to expand the cake. So that's my contribution.
The community financing one is indeed an interesting model that works in some of the water schemes. So,
I have a process issue to raise.
Yeah.
I have complaints from civil society who say, and I wasn't aware, that they haven't been able to access some of these plenaries, these breakaway groups, and they're very distressed about that. And so please can you note that down?
Okay.
From a transparency and participatory.
Okay. These are the people online.
These are people online and who even in some of the other sessions would like to contribute and they're not able to.
Is it? Okay. Oh, so there's not a Q&A type of live point taken. I think it's yeah.
Apparently they're not in this one. And so they streamed, I think it seems like in the one group.
Okay.
Even in that there isn't a Q&A.
Yeah, it might be a technical issue.
Yeah, so people are very upset about that.
Okay. Thank you. There's a lady that did not have an opportunity in front, yes? Yes? Go. Next to the cameraman. Mark? Yes.
Thank you. Putting on my Mpumalanga hat and stepping away from government and the PCC. Just a few comments here. There are a lot of people coming in with donor funding, going into municipalities and going into the public space saying, we're here to help you, we're doing this. And there seems to be a lot of redundancy and duplication. So for me, what mechanisms are we putting in place so that we can monitor this and collaborate and coordinate? Because if you've got a whole little bits of effort sitting and we combine, we can use economy of scale to get better results. I, for example, was wanting to go into a municipality now with a project just to find out there's 4 other guys already in that municipality. And it seems to be there's a lot of redundancy. And a lot of this work currently is focused on business plans, which is there to generate income and money and investment for people like the contractors here and the local communities to benefit. So if we can find some mechanism to combine this, the JET IP, we need to support it with the surrounding economy, but also looking at how do we strengthen the economy around it. It doesn't help us we have this phenomenal program and the rest of it's collapsing. if we're not also focusing on the other underlying. Municipalities are currently what keeps our roads, our water, and the front line of electrical supply. In terms of what the lady from civil society said here, I just want to say revolution starts at home. What's happening a lot, government's being criticized, is why are you telling all of us in the private sector to do ABCD, but you're not doing it? So what are we doing, and this is particularly for Treasury here, what are we doing to enable government to also implement the systems in terms of energy saving, to be on the front line, to set the examples? Key here is schools and clinics which were raised. They cannot put up their own energy independent systems at this stage because they cannot go beyond the 3-year commitment in terms of the Public Finance Management Act. What mechanisms are we looking at to support them? Where we basically take OPEX, as you said, we need to take our own money, we take the operational money and we convert it into CAPEX. And we can long-term increase the budget availability for the capital program through doing that. For example, solar panels pay themselves off in 3 to 5 years, and the rest of the money then you would have used for electricity, barring O&M, you can then put back into other capital projects. The other mention here was taxation reforms. Very good that SARS a while ago said, here's a tax break, put in solar. We're giving money to people with money, the people that are doing tax. What are we doing for the poorest of the poor in the society? In society, how are we getting electricity to them? Why don't we zero VAT, for example, solar panels, and we also go and we say no import tax, and we fix the price of solar panels. And we make sure that we make it affordable for everybody in this country to get solar panels. We take those people off the grid, gives more availability to Eskom, business, the economy grows. So let's not just look at the macro. I hear what DBSA says in terms of we're looking at macro, we're looking at big projects, mining. Those are quick wins. But where do we looking at, I think you said you're looking at the CNI offtake. Why are we not looking at the household offtakes? Okay, and also focusing on that. And I think there's a very good model internationally called crowdfunding. Many of the schools these days that want to put in electricity and solar panels and alternative sources are going the crowdfunding route because they cannot enter into any form of agreement in terms of financing these infrastructures. So let's look the formal versus the informal. Let's look macro versus micro and kind of use crowdfunding and see how we can catalytically also get the micro economy moving and to support us here in our endeavors.
Okay, thank you. We are at the end of our session, but there's a couple of burning hands. One, and then the lady at the back, and then we'll have to close.
Thanks. All right, so I'll run through these questions very quickly. So the current JET IP, subject to revisions, is what we're discussing, right? Like financing the current JET IP priority areas. It's difficult, and perhaps somebody could explain this to us, right? How are we looking, or what are you negotiating on in terms of finance? Is it the current JET IP which is going to be revised? How is this all happening? If we need USD 90 billion, right, or 1.4 trillion to support our JET IP, but that JET IP is itself being revised, what exactly are you currently doing? Which financiers are you approaching, and on which priority sectors? The simple question is, can you tell us whether or not the allocation of 319 billion to the green hydrogen sector can in fact be changed going forward? We've heard a lot of people complain about green hydrogen, but could we please get a clear answer on whether or not that priority sector can be adjusted? We see only 1.65 billion, for example, allocated to social ownership energy models. So is that something that can be changed? Who is going to be leading the climate finance task team going forward so that we can understand who do we approach around some of these ongoing issues? We understand this is a living document, etc., but we would really like to understand how you are mobilizing the rest of the finance. And the other question is, can you tell us the risks that you have picked up either locally or internationally, in relation to mobilizing the remaining finance? Do you think that the electricity minister's comments on extending the life of coal beyond Eskom's decommissioning dates, for example, presents a risk in mobilizing additional climate finance? And finally, on air pollution, if Medupi and Kusile are going to run up until at least 2050 and require air pollution abatement technology, is the JET IP or any other process going to look into obtaining the finance necessary in order to install that technology, in order to properly incorporate the justice elements into our just energy transition? Because this is not being spoken about at all. And even mining rehabilitation. So these are things that impact communities directly surrounding these coal-fired power stations or affected by coal mining. And yet so little attention is being paid to mining rehabilitation or to air pollution abatement technology. I think those are all my questions for now. We have submitted full comments as Life After Coal and the Fair Finance Coalition. But again, we need to be able to be in a space where we get answers to our questions so that we are able to properly engage with this process so that the full expertise of civil society and other stakeholders can come to bear on this process.
Thanks. And I think just my short comment on that, the JET IP does not replace anything. So we must just be, there was a lady, yes?
Okay.
And I'll give Joanne and then Deepak to end, otherwise you'll have a small lunch.
Okay, so apologies on time, and I'm here representing the youth. So what I initially did was I put up my hand and we had all these questions because we prepared for the session, you know, coming from my constituents. And then I sat here and I listened, and trust me, it was very informative and I'm super grateful for it. But one thing that ran in my mind the whole way through was, if I was sitting in my normal university class and someone came to me and told me about all of these things, and I studied finance in university, I studied, you know, law, like, you know, I'm not stupid, but a lot of this really did a lot to my brain. I have to go back, I have to think about it after a week, and then maybe I'll email some questions. But in the meantime, I've got like 10 essays to do. So maybe my questions will never be asked, because when are you going to reply to my email? So it goes back to her point, my constituent here, that where is the proper form of communication here? And then also, what is it doing to the regular income that a student has and a recent graduate? Because that's where I suppose most of my constituents are coming from, is that there's this really big plan in the macroeconomy, but in our everyday economy, it's increasing rent, the price of petrol, bread, whether or not I can do my hair, just like, you know, regular expenses. And I just wanted to know if maybe moving forward, there could be a proper channel of communication in that way regarding the youth and government, especially on this forum. Because a lot of people are saying a lot of things here, which I do understand, but what if someone here isn't me? What if someone here had to travel from Hammanskraal, Diep Kloof, so on, and they can understand a lot more than me, but don't have the chance, like I said, to raise their hand, you know? So that's where I'm coming from. Thank you very much for everybody's questions.
Joanne?
Thank you, and I don't know whether I'm jumping in where maybe Deepak should. So I think I know quite a lot of people in this room and some whom I don't. But I'm working, I introduced myself as being from the JET IP PMU. I last year headed up the secretariat that produced the investment plan. And so I think that the one thing that we should do before we break is to talk a bit about the process going forward. And I think in particular the questions that people are asking about, how do they engage, how do they participate, where does this go to going forward? And I'm not going to be able to answer all of them because I think some of these things are not yet settled or resolved. So I'm not going to pretend to have answers where I don't. But I think the one important thing to say is that there's a very tiny team working on this at the moment, but fundamentally we had agreed to wait and to see what the outcome
of this consultation process is to see what the recommendations are that the PCC makes to the President, to see what the President's response is before we kind of jump in and try and establish a whole lot of, I don't know whether it's structures or programs or whatever it is. So I think it was important to give space to this process and then to be able to take guidance. Having said that, is the JET IP cast in stone? No, it is not cast in stone. And I think already it is clear that there are issues in the JET IP, and I think Leanne has just raised some of them where in actual fact there is further work to be done. So let me give you an example. I think across the board, every single stakeholder has said that what is said about skills in the JET IP is inadequate and that there is a lot more work that needs to be done. And as an area for investment, there's got to be a lot more financing probably that goes into it. So I think we've taken that and already in kind of part of what we're saying needs to be done going forward, there needs to be a relook at that skills issue. There needs to be more work done. We need to be able to review that in the light of what the stakeholders are saying, but also, and then kind of basically go back and review those sections of the IP. As one example of areas, I think the other issue that has been raised is this issue of social ownership, whether it's social ownership models across the board, whether it's of renewables or whether it's of enterprises, whatever it is, there's got to be a lot more work and probably a lot more resources that go into it. So I think we've heard those kinds of messages through the consultation and are starting to say, let's see how we can program them. I think the issue of project preparation is another. I think the issue that was raised about how do we prevent or find ways to work around duplication and fragmentation that happens with duplication, and how do we work much more closely with the Mpumalanga stakeholders is another. So all of those issues are on our agenda, but I think until this consultation process is concluded, it's quite hard to say exactly what can be done or what can't be done. I think there are probably going forward two things that are, for me, are important in relation to particularly the stakeholder process. I think everybody has looked at this document. It's a document. You've said you love some of it, you hate some of it. My question is really, what is it and how should we be working with these groupings of stakeholders, with all of you in the room going forward in such a way that the investment that we manage to generate, whether grant, some of it grants, some of it loans, some of it that's going to go to the public sector, some of it that's going to the private sector. How can the level of engagement and interest and involvement that all of you are seeking in the process be taken forward so that in actual fact we are meeting the kinds of needs that are being expressed here? I think that probably it means a number of smaller meetings that are starting to look in particular at what are the kinds of interventions. And again, all of you during the course of this, your inputs in this conversation today have started to say we want to see this happen or that happen. And I think that it is important. The Minister spoke earlier on about governance, and I think that is something else that is not settled as I understand it yet, is how do we set up both a transparent and a robust form of governance for this process, and a form of governance that allows for stakeholders to both engage, to be able to monitor, to participate, to monitor, and to be able to assess whether the kinds of things that are burning to them on these issues are being met. So, Deepak, I think that just to give a sense of where we are at in the process, but I think some of the things that are going to be important going forward, because I don't think that we can see the consultation and the engagement ending with the end of the PCC consultative process. And I just thought it would be useful to maybe give a flavor of some of the work that we are seeing going forward. Thanks.
I'm mindful of time as well. Deepak, 2 minutes and then we'll close. Okay.
I just wanted to make a few high-level remarks. Number one, the JET IP itself, and this the PCC will say. So I'm going to give you a sense of how the PCC's own recommendations after listening to stakeholders is emerging. It's an investment plan. It is not, in our view, yet an implementation plan. First point. The second point is that it came into being within the context and constraint of an offer that was made by a group of jurisdictions in the lead up to COP26. And as Minister Gordhan said today, and the President has said, the grant component of that offer is insufficient. However, do we or don't we take it is a question, I think, for our geopolitical analysis at a political level to make a decision on. I don't think it is in this room that one can say we do not want the JET IP. The JET IP is a longer range plan than what was envisaged to be catalytic contribution in the 8.5 billion. And so that 8.5 billion, I'm not going to go through every single rand and cent of it, but some of it, yes, is flowing through the National Treasury as sovereign loans, all in the context of National Treasury's own fiscal limits, all of it in the context of what National Treasury would have had to raise in global financial markets denominated in foreign currency. And I can assure you that the terms of those concessional loans at various stages and quite advanced in some instances of being finalized between individual donors from the 5 jurisdictions, not all of 5, are going to be at least 300 to 425 basis points cheaper than what the sovereign of its own bat with respect to sovereign rating would have been able to raise. That's the first point. So this notion of we're financing all of it with unsustainable debt, I'm really sorry, but I have to push back and say I don't know where that view is coming from. The second set of issues related to the grant components, and I think Anna Lee has latched onto something. Each of the donors is looking at ways in which in those grant components to make an impact, and a lot of them have started focusing on Mpumalanga. The critical issue here is what is that going to be used for? How do we ensure no duplication? How do we ensure that the final point of utilization of that element of the grant package is in fact going to either clearly leverage and de-risk critical projects on the ground, but more importantly, how do they get packaged in a way, because they're insufficient, to stimulate additional tranches, whether that be blended finance, whether that be project portfolioization, and getting the scale that the financial markets need to be able to, sometimes kicking and screaming, being dragged into financing those. Those are the critical questions to be asked. A sticking point around green hydrogen, and this again, I don't understand why such a degree of abhorrence for green hydrogen. Because green hydrogen, if the country as a whole, through its democratic and policy framework, chooses to make it an industrial policy going forward, then that is what it's going to be. And the PCC is going to say, with respect to green hydrogen, this is a clear statement of intent. If it isn't yet as clear as we'd like to see it, government needs to make it a policy imperative as part of its industrial development program. And where the financing for that comes from, I know there's this notion that limited grants are going to go onto private companies' balance sheets. Not necessarily true, maybe not necessarily untrue either, but there is an industrial development corporation which is tasked with the job of promoting as well as promoting existing industry and developing new ones. So when you ask what are the transparent mechanisms, there are institutions which will unfold a country's choice as it relates to what the future industrial base of the country needs to look at. On EVs, again, yes, we heard stakeholders saying, but you're going to subsidize motor manufacturing, but we are going to preserve jobs. But the PCC is going to go further and say the areas of weakness in the JET IP is that it does not pay sufficient attention to the domestic market as it relates to electric vehicles, but more importantly, to mass public transport
as it relates to localized, ensuring that we meet both the people's needs as well as the decarbonization objective. And then finally, the issue of our freight system. So we have heard, and as Joanne says, the consultations and the conversation does not stop with this event, but we do need to, at some point, draw a line in the sand and say, this is what stakeholders said, and we're going to do that diligently and sincerely in the form of a stakeholder report to the President. And then the PCC, having processed those stakeholder feedback, including from this National Colloquium, as well as considering, as I said, the NDCs, the Just Transition Framework, some of the imperatives for municipal capacity, some of the imperatives with respect to what we are now understanding to be limited domestic, what we call capital markets absorptive capacity, begin to look at how much is international, how much is local, how much is public, how much is private. And really that $90 billion, let's not talk about $90 billion, let's talk about 1.4 trillion rand, so that we know what we're talking about. Some of it might be dollar denominated, depending on whether we localize solar panels, for example, or not. So it's a very complex set of issues. What I would like to think is that these dialogues on an ongoing basis do not stop implementation, number one. We need to get on the road to doing. We need to build unity in action, as the Minister said this morning. And then finally, we need to treat the JET IP as part of a JET, as part of a JTF. And so as we undertake this journey, we need to get closer together on critical issues rather than further apart.
Thanks, Deepak. And I want to thank everyone for it was a tough conversation, and I did not expect this. But I think it's needed, and it must be continued. The one thing that my takeaway is that as humans, we're still too much in a binary mode, one or the other. And I think that's the problem. That's how our views are formed, and that's just how we are. But if we want to get to a transformational change, it's about that integration, about ideas, models, different mixes, etc., and not say this one over the other, because I think that's where a lot of these problems have. So with that, you've been a wonderful group of participants, and the session is officially closed. Thank you.